Sorry, just the recording notification there. Professor James Liszka from New York State University, Plattsburgh, who will be speaking to us on the development of the normative science of ethics in Peirce. After the presentation, we'll have three discussants. We'll have Richard Atkins from Boston College, Beadle from Northumbria University, and Cornelius duvall from Indiana. If you do have any questions, we hope to have a little bit of time at the end. Please use the Q&A functionality, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Type any questions that you have in there, and we'll come back to you towards the end of the seminar and answer those for you. So I think without further ado, we'll get on with the presentation, and I'll hand over to Professor Liszka.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. And I wanted to really sincerely thank you for attending the webinar. And I also especially want to thank my interlocutors here, Richard Atkins, Beadle, and Cornelius duvall, for taking the time out to serve in that capacity. So just let me share my screen with you. I have a PowerPoint that might make the talk a little bit easier to follow. So let me do that now. Okay, can everybody see the PowerPoint? Just want to make sure it's up and running. Yes, okay. All right, so as advertised, my topic for today is the development of the normative science of ethics in Peirce. And the big question and the central question I want to ask is what motivates Peirce to develop this normative science of ethics and aesthetics? After all, he's best known as the founder of semiotics, an expert in logic and scientific methodology. So why is he concerned about ethics? And I'm arguing here that there are three reinforcing motivators for Peirce. First of all, as you know, Peirce is living in the 19th century, late 19th century, and he was becoming more and more concerned about the growing instrumental use of science as witnessed by the 19th century Industrial Revolution and the so-called Gilded Age of America. Secondly, Peirce recognized that his logic, his semiotic as it's generally called, which was understood as a general methodology for science, was normative, that it prescribed ways of reasoning. And as such, since it prescribed things, it needed to be grounded in ethics, the science of what ought to be done. And thirdly, Peirce realized after a while that his pragmatic maxim not only presaged the transposition of theory to practice, scientific theory to practical application, but in doing so fostered the sort of instrumentalist ethic that he abhorred, he didn't like. So let me explain each of these three motivations in a little bit more detail. So first of all, Peirce was becoming more and more concerned about the growing instrumental use of science. This becomes pretty clear in his Cambridge lectures of 1898, particularly the first lecture, Philosophy and the Conduct of Life. There he makes, as some would say, a somewhat exaggerated argument for the separation of theory and practice. He says in the famous quote, "The two masters, theory and practice, you cannot serve." His main point in the lectures seems to be that the end, the goal of science is truth, and the application of science is a secondary matter that in fact could corrupt its primary purpose. So that's one of the central, it seems to me, one of the central themes of the Cambridge lectures. A few years later, Peirce also makes this concern clear in a review of Karl Pearson's Grammar of Science in 1901, Peirce was a very famous scientist and mathematician, English scientist and mathematician, follower of Darwin. And in fact, there was a lot of agreement in statistical theory between Peirce's theory and Pearson's theory. But anyways, Peirce claims that the end of science that Peirson supposes to perpetuate the human race and to stabilize societies based on Darwinism of the time, Peirce claims that, among other things, this would make for quote unquote bad ethics and would quote unquote retard the growth of science. Also in that review, he rails against the instrumental use of science. So here's the quote. It says, the worst feature of the present state of things in science is that the great majority of the members of many scientific societies and a large part of others are men whose chief interest in science is as a means of gaining money and who have a contempt or half contempt for pure science. Now, to declare that the sole reason for scientific research is the good of society is to encourage those pseudo-scientists to claim and the general public to admit that they, who deal with the application of knowledge, are the true men of science, and that the theoreticians are little better than idlers, end quote. Peirce also, around this time, writes an article for the New York Evening Post about the great men of science, praising those who pursued science for science's sake. Peirce was also not only worried about the growing instrumental use of science that might corrupt the practice of science, but he was also worried about the development of ethical theories supposedly based on science, particularly evolutionary theory, Darwinism at the time, that if followed, he thought would corrupt the practice of science. So as early as 1893, he writes a very famous article, Evolutionary Love, which disavows the social Darwinism of his day. And essentially focuses on, he understands social Darwinism as the idea that the conflict or struggle among individuals, competition among individuals will produce a great common or public good. So he really disavows that idea, and he thinks that that will corrupt the practice, certainly corrupt the practice of science. He argues instead for an ethic, this idea of evolutionary love, that's conducive to the advance of science that involves an intergenerational altruism with the goal of making things better and passing it on. So it's an ethic that's certainly opposed to many of the tenets that you see in social Darwinism of the time. Second, the second motivation, let me talk about some evidence for that. Peirce certainly recognized that his logic, understood as a methodology for science, was normative, and therefore it needed to be grounded in ethics. So if you look at his classifications of sciences, his later ones, you will see a kind of hierarchy in the normative sciences. So first you have aesthetics, then ethics, then logic or semiotic. And in a letter to William James in 1902, he writes, quote, "It was not until after the Cambridge lectures in 1898 that I obtained the proof that logic must be founded on ethics, of which it is a higher development. Even then, I was for some time so stupid as not to see that ethics rests in the same manner on the foundation of aesthetics, by which it is needless to say, I don't mean milk and water and sugar. In other words, it's just not a mixture of those two, but a coherent integration of those three studies. And as many of you may know, what Peirce means by aesthetics is not the traditional understanding of a theory of beauty. Rather, it's concerned about the admirable or the beautiful quality of ends. So it's a different kind of science than what you see in traditional thinking around this time. Third, Peirce, the third motivation, right, where Peirce realized that his pragmatic maxim not only presaged the transposition of theory to practice, theory to application, but in doing so, fostered the sort of instrumentalist ethic that he abhorred, right? So let me talk about that motivation as well. It's a little bit more involved, but very essential to his thinking about the role of ethics. So we all probably know the classic formulation of the pragmatic maxim that he makes in 1878 and How to Make Our Ideas Clear. It goes like this, quote, "Consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have, then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object," end of quote. So I've emphasized there the idea of practical bearings as a key component or element of pragmatic maxim. And I would argue that the pragmatic maxim demonstrates two things. First of all, that theoretical claims or theoretical hypotheses, empirical ones, can be transposed into practical ones. So to take his classic example of the scratch hardness of diamonds, if diamonds are scratch hard, then they should be able to cut or scratch other materials less hard, right? And we know that diamonds are indeed the material that has the highest scratch hardness, right? Then they could cut glass. So that means that if people want to cut glass, then they should use a diamond cutter. So there's an easy way to, what the pragmatic maxim shows is an easy way to transpose the theoretical claim into a practical one. But secondly, it also shows that the truth of the practical claim, the practical hypothesis, depends on the truth of its corresponding empirical or theoretical one. If it were the case that diamonds were not scratch hard, then it wouldn't make any sense to try to use them to cut glass, for example. So Peirce realizes later on that the pragmatic maxim is really nothing more than what Kant called a hypothetical or pragmatic maxim. And here's the central quote here, right here. "Pragmatism is the principle that every theoretical judgment expressible in a sentence in the indicative mood is a confused form of thought whose only meaning, if it has any, lies in its tendency to enforce a corresponding practical maxim expressible as a conditional sentence having its apodosis in the imperative mood." Typical of Peirce's fashion, style, you could say this a lot more simply. In other words, what the pragmatic maxim says is if X is an end, do Y. So if it's the case that if X, then Y, then if X is an end, then do Y, right? So again, it shows or demonstrates the idea of the transposition of the theoretical to the practical, and it forms the basis of a maxim that is, if you desire that end or if you want that end, then this is what you should do, right? You should do Y. So so in the foundations of the metaphysics of morals, Kant characterizes quote unquote pragmatic imperatives as essentially prudential rules of how best to attain certain kinds of ends. So he defines it as a form of prudence that, quote unquote, instructs the world how it could provide for its interest better than, or at least as well as has been done in the past. So thus, for Kant, the pragmatic is focused on the attainment of ends and goals, and it's a form of prudential advice. If you want these ends, here's what you should do, right? Here's the best means to attain those particular ends. So in What Pragmatism Is in 1905, Peirce explains this adoption of Kant's sense of the pragmatic, right? So he says, some friends suggested that I call my philosophy practicalism. And then he has this quote, but for one who had learned philosophy out of Kant and who still thought in Kantian terms most readily, praktisch and pragmatisch were as far apart as the two poles, the former belonging in a region of thought where no mind of the experimentalist type can ever make sure of solid ground under his feet, the latter expressing a relation to some definite human purpose. And he emphasizes there that it's the connection between rational cognition and rational purpose that determined the preference for the name pragmatism. So for any of those familiar with Kant, one knows that you would know that praktisch has to do with the core practical reason, which is understood as an aspect of the more, what Peirce would think, ethereal realm of moral law. So the hypothetical or pragmatic maxim is essentially, a form of practical reasoning. So practical reasoning, as it's developed by, more or less contemporary philosophers, has this kind of general form. People desire or want or intend a certain kind of end. They believe that some set of actions will likely attain that end. Therefore, if they desire that end, then they ought to do those actions that they believe will attain it. So people like philosophers like Hilary Putnam, for example, say that this pretty much defines rationality. So it's a kind of rational prudential norm. People ought to do what is likely to attain those ends they desire. It would be irrational if you desired something to do something that would not attain it. So it's a way of also defining rationality for this particular reason. But the problem with practical reasoning in this sense and rationality, particularly as it's understood by economists as just pursuit of self-interest, whatever you desire, you try to get, is that it's amorally instrumental. It doesn't determine whether the ends that are desired are good or ill, nor does it determine whether the means that are prescribed are right or wrong, only what will likely attain that end. So whatever the end, here's the best means, but it doesn't tell you whether that's right to do or wrong. Moreover, the ends that are selected are subjectively determined. So it's based on what an individual desires. It's based on self-interest. And therefore, there's no, on the basis of this, no objective way to really talk about whether the ends are right or wrong, since they're just subjectively determined. So the irony that Peirce must have realized is that his pragmatic maxim, when you play it out, all its consequences, actually fosters the instrumental use of science that he was arguing against. And, so how does Kant try to, or how does Peirce try to solve this? Well, we know what Kant's solution to this problem was. Kant's solution to the instrumentality of hypothetical imperatives, pragmatic maxims, was to argue for what he called categorical imperatives. That is, fundamental duties that must be done and constrain whatever means you're pursuing and whatever ends you're trying to attain. And those of you who are philosophers or study ethics or know something about Kant probably recognize this general formulation of the categorical imperative. You should act only according to the maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So in other words, if you're about to do something hypothetically as a hypothetical imperative, let's suppose, for example, that you make a promise to pay back somebody the money that you've loaned without keeping that promise. If that were to become universalized, then obviously there would be this absurdity because promise keeping would make no sense whatsoever. Why would anybody accept a promise if they knew that everybody would not keep it? Right? So there's a kind of absurdity when you universalize false promises. There's not that absurdity when you keep your promises. So the upshot is that if people seek, for example, wealth as an end, they can't lie, they can't cheat, they can't steal to do so, since such actions can't be universalized without absurdity or contradiction. Now, Peirce, interestingly, as much of a fan Peirce is of Kant, he rejects the categorical imperative and the Kantian solution to the problem of instrumental reason. So he says this clearly, quote here, Kant, as you know, proposes to allow that categorical imperative to stand unchallenged, an eternal pronouncement. His position is in extreme disfavor now, and not without a reason. Now, there's been several arguments criticizing the categorical imperative. One that perhaps makes the most sense here in this context is one that's proposed by Philippa Foot. She argues that really the categorical imperatives are implicitly hypothetical ones. So she gives the example of rules of etiquette. Rules of etiquette just appear to be something categorical. You abide by the rules of etiquette because you want to be polite. So they're just are what they are. So they're categorical in that sense. But to do so requires some sort of desire to be polite. And she argues that the same is with morality. Categorical imperatives do not answer the question of why be moral, but they do tell people what they must do, what duties they have, if their actions are to be counted as moral. She argues that people could still reject the categorical imperative if they have no interest in being moral. She says they could be called moral monsters, but they would still be perfectly rational in the economic sense of rationality, where you're pursuing what best achieves your self-interest. Now, Peirce's reasons for rejecting the categorical imperative are somewhat different. He objects to its analytic methodology. He argues that ethical matters cannot, quote unquote, be reduced to a mere formalism, as Kant seems to propose. And he also believes that ethical principles really can't be proven once and for all by such means by a singular thinker who thinks this up. Now, as we saw in the explanation of the categorical imperative, Kant uses a version of a type of mathematical proof called reductio ad absurdum, reducing to absurdity, which Peirce, among other mathematicians, reject as a suspect method of proof. So in the reductio absurdum, you assume the thing that is contrary to what you want to prove, and then you show that that assumption leads to an inherent contradiction, and based on that, you suppose then that the contrary there, the one you want to prove is the right one, right? So it's kind of an indirect proof, and many mathematicians do suspect it as not a valid way to prove things. Rather, Peirce, based on his evolutionism and his cynicism and other consonant ideas and concepts, thinks that the ethical norms and principles that are best will be ones that resolve through a process of inquiry in the context of experiments of living over time. So Peirce replaces or objects to Kant's notion of universalization in favor of a concept of generalization. That is something that you might say is statistical over time, something that happens for the most part over time. So he argues that the methodology for ethics must be based on a synthetical process, one that's garnered from experience, not from formal arguments, and not to be settled by an appeal to the principle of contradiction. So he concludes in this passage here, quote, almost everybody will now agree, since Darwin, I guess, that the ultimate good lies in the evolutionary process in some way. If so, it is not in individual reactions in their segregation, but in something general or continuous. Cynicism is founded on the notion that the coalescence, the becoming continuous, the becoming governed by laws, the becoming instinct with general ideas, are but phases of one and the same process of the growth of reasonableness. So he introduces this term, reasonableness, here. So that, of course, needs explanation. So Peirce's sense of generalizability does not rest on formal contradiction, but actual concrete empirical manifestation, what plays out in history as people attempt to determine what ethical rules or principles ought to guide their lives. So Peirce is really forced by the pragmatic maxim to be a moral consequentialist, or better said, a teleologist. And I'll try to explain that shortly. So the meaning of promising for him is not the proof of why promising, for example, would be a good moral rule to follow would not because then it's contrary, if universalized, would lead to an absurdity, but by the fact that its consequences, that if there's a prevalence of keeping promises in a society or community, then the practical consequences of that would be one that would allow it to continue to be realized. So same with false promising. The meaning of false promising is found in its practical consequences and the purposes it entails. So one supposes that it can be predicted that promise breaking could not be generalizable in Peirce's terms. It can be exceptional in that, statistically speaking, a minority of folks could break their promises, or the same person could keep their promise one day and break it the next. but it could never become widespread enough so that the ends and the goals of promise keeping could be attained. So promise keeping, among other things, ensures the stability and purpose of contracts. If the greater trend in society was to break agreements, then contract making would be fruitless enterprise, not absurd, but fruitless. And a society without some form of promise keeping or truth telling as a norm would hardly attain many of the ends that are needed to retain some modicum of social stability or cooperation. So the whole problem of sociality, that is, how do we work with one another in order to attain our ends, really wouldn't be facilitated if people, for the most part, broke their promises. This would not be realizable. So Peirce, I would argue here, really is adopting an Aristotelian approach to ethics rather than a Kantian one. As much as he admires Kant, he also admires Aristotle as much. So he thinks that it's possible, like Aristotle, to identify a highest end which would constrain all other ends and the righteous means to those particular ends. So those of you who may be familiar with Aristotle's ethics know, of course, that in the opening of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle claims that all human activity aims at some end, and for that reason, there had to be a highest end at which all those particular ends aimed. And he thought that the end in question, the highest end, had to be happiness, or some philosophers translated, I think the better translation is the idea of flourishing. So the idea of flourishing is that you're realizing all your human capacity in the way in which you're living. You know, Aristotle makes this claim that everybody is trying to attain certain kinds of ends. They're trying to make a living, attain some wealth, raise a family, have companionship, have some sort of status, all these different things. And all these things are for the purpose ultimately of flourishing, right? And he argued that the means, the righteous means to flourishing, was enacted in virtuous activity. So the person or people who were, you know, relatively honest, or fair-minded, temperate, kind, just, would be people who would tend to have a flourishing life. People who were intemperate, could not control their desires for pleasures, who were not honest, who were not fair-minded, who were cowardly, would not likely be able to attain that highest end of flourishing. So Aristotle's solution to the instrumentality of practical reasoning, everybody's seeking their ends, is this idea of what he calls phronesis. It's understood as a kind of practical wisdom that people can acquire that could help them discern good ends and righteous means. So the person with phronesis tends to be virtuous, tends to know what justice is, tends to act in a fair-minded way, acts courageously when it's appropriate, controls their fear, is temperate, all these different kinds of things. But they also are able to discern what the better ends of human endeavor are, right? So as he defines it here, phronesis is the disposition with true reason and ability for actions concerning human goods. People who have phronesis, quote unquote, can aim well at the things which are attainable by action and are best for man, end of quote. So phronesis is this capacity, this kind of reasoning that goes beyond practical reasoning to discern not only the best means or the likely means to an end, but also to determine which ends are good to attain and what are the best moral means by which to attain those particular ends. What are the righteous ways to do that? So my argument is that that Peirce is really modeling his ethics more after Aristotle than after Kant for that reason. And he realizes that his pragmatic maxim is really this kind of hypothetical pragmatic maxim, hypothetical imperative, which entails practical reasoning, but practical reasoning is instrumental, as we talked about, morally instrumental. It doesn't tell us what ends are good and what means are best to attain ends. But it has to be enhanced by something like Aristotle's notion of phronesis, if we're going to model this after Aristotle. So like Aristotle, Peirce thought that agency, human agency, was constituted by purpose. Again, Aristotle says in the opening lines of the Nicomachean Ethics, all human actions aim at some good. And if people were goal-directed, then as Aristotle thought, if the highest end could be discerned, there should be a convergence in thought and in action towards that highest end. If it's true that all people in Aristotle's terms are seeking to flourish, then that would constrain which ends they chose and which means they would choose to attain those particular ends. So Peirce, I believe, is arguing in a similar fashion. Now, Peirce talks about some criteria for this ultimate or this final end. He thinks, obviously, that first of all, the end had to be something that was attractive. It would be very strange if people found the ultimate end to be repulsive or something they would want to avoid. It could hardly be an ultimate end if that were the case. So the ultimate end had to be something that people found fine and admirable. And this is part of the purpose of the aesthetics, to kind of articulate what the criteria might be and possibly what ends might fit that criterion. Secondly, in accordance with his consequentialism and teleological thinking, it had to be something that could be realized and consistently pursued in life. So life constrains action. And so whatever ideals or ends or means we try to articulate or try to develop or pursue has to somehow conform or be possible, be realized, and consistently so within the confines of the constraints of living. And it had to be something that, by measuring its consequences, could be generalizable. That is, it's something that if most, if not all people were to pursue, could be pursued and realized in that way. Right? So just as false promise making could not be generalized, it could not be consistently pursued, it could not be fully realized, promise keeping could, we suppose. Now, in terms of this ultimate end, Peirce's difference with Aristotle was that he did not see happiness or flourishing as the final end. First of all, Peirce did not think that the final end would be something that could be discerned, fully formed by anybody ahead of its development in experiments of living. Rather, so he argued that the final end was something that people would tend to converge toward in their beliefs and pursuits over time, just as that would be the case for empirical truths. It would also be the case for moral truths. Here's a quote here. Accordingly, the pragmaticist, as he calls himself at this time, does not make the summum bonum, the highest good, to consist in action, but makes it to consist in that process of evolution whereby the existent comes more and more to embody those generals, which were just now said to be destined, which is what we strive to express in calling them reasonable. So there's that term reasonable again. So Peirce disagrees with Aristotle on the nature of the final or ultimate ends. Peirce proposes as a hypothesis that reasonableness is this final end. And so what does he mean by reasonableness? And if he argues that the final end cannot be determined ahead of its development in experiments of living, why does he propose this ultimate end, right? Reasonableness. So these are puzzles that Peirce has to answer. Based on my own scholarship of Peirce, I would say that by reasonableness, Peirce means a couple of things. But essentially, what it involves is what he calls self-correction. So self-correction is a process of self-control, he calls, in which people would forego false beliefs in favor of ones less prone to error. So the model here is the scientist who endeavors to discover true hypotheses, or at least hypotheses that are free from error. And once he or she detects that a hypothesis that they favor is subject to error, it doesn't predict what it predicts, it has certain kinds of anomalies or certain kinds of conceptual problems, then the scientist gives it up and seeks another hypothesis. So without that capacity for self-correction in individuals and in practices, people would retain false beliefs. So for example, in his famous article on the fixation of belief, he talks about communities that are not self-correcting, right? Communities based on authority, in which people simply dogmatically assert something to be true based on simply the authority of the asserter, or people who are censorious and tend to want to believe what they want to believe and therefore don't entertain other kinds of beliefs. So those kinds of communities and those kinds of individuals don't self-correct. Therefore, they are less likely, for that reason, to light upon the truth, and they're going to be more prone to error. And he argues that self-correction is implied in his thesis of fallibilism. So fallibilism is the idea that you cannot prove anything to be absolutely true, but there's no reason to doubt a belief if you can't find it subject to error. So it's important to act on those beliefs that have not been shown to be erroneous until at some time in the future, if it ever happens, that belief does prove to be erroneous, right? So self-correction allows one to operate on beliefs that have relative stability, that are relatively fixated in his terms, but with the option, with the eye towards the fact that they may be erroneous in the long run, right, in some respect. Self-correction also implies certain kinds of virtues, he argues. Honesty. It's hard to determine whether a belief is true or not if you're not honest about the evidence that supports it. A certain kind of humility in which one doesn't have the audacity to think that your belief is absolutely true. There's a certain kind of humbleness that, after all, your belief, well, this is what I believe, I have the evidence for it, but yeah, it could still be wrong, right? And another virtue is the idea that, well, in order for me to, any person, to believe as they believe, to have some sort of fixation of beliefs, they have to test this against people. They have to join in an inquiry with others. There has to be this intergenerational practice, right, in which you pass on what you know to the next generation and work together with others in order to do that. And then self-correction, for that reason, also implies this desire to inquire and to seek the truth. So what Peirce is saying when he suggests that reasonableness is this highest end is that really, in effect, reasonableness is the means, the most likely means by which people would be able to determine what the ultimate end is. So it's something that guarantees a process. The self-correction tends to lead to the truth. Therefore, self-correction is essential in order to find this ultimate end. And the reasonable, given that the reasonableness is something like self-correction, it's different than being rational in the economic sense. It's not self-interested, for one thing, and you can be tenacious, you can be dogmatic, you can be authoritative and still be rational, and you can be amoral and still be rational. But being reasonable is a case of embracing self-correction. And that seems to be his point. So finally, let me conclude here. These are the motivations for Peirce to develop his normative science of ethics. I think he sees this more as in light of Aristotle than in Kant. He's looking for, perhaps you might say, a scientific version of Aristotle's notion of phronesis, attempt to study the ends of human conduct and the righteous ways to obtain them. So he says, for example, and these sciences could correct the instrumentalism of his pragmatic maxim. So he says, now here in 1902, the true nature of pragmatism cannot be understood without them, without the normative sciences. So it was the normative sciences that were needed to transform pragmatism from mere instrumentalism to a proper ethical outlook by supplying the ends of human endeavor and the righteous means by which they might be attained. So aesthetics would be the science of ends in the sense of determining what ends are admirable in you might say in Plato and Aristotle's sense of tokelon. Ethics would determine which among the admirable ends are good to pursue. Logic and scientific reasoning would, in this capacity, be used to determine the most effective means to those ends. And ethics, again, would determine which among those effective means are morally right to use. Unfortunately, Peirce does not have the time in his life to complete this particular project, although a lot of it can be discerned from parts of his writing, and some of the incompleteness in his thinking can be inferred to some body of work. So I try to develop this idea in my book, Charles Peirce on ethics, aesthetics, and the normative sciences. So this is one aspect or one on part of that book. So thanks a lot for your attention. I hope I didn't run over too much. And now I can return the stage to my interlocutors here.
Thank you so much for that really fascinating presentation. I think we're all looking forward to your forthcoming book. So now I'd like to move straight over to the first of our three discussants this evening, Professor Richard Atkins from Boston College. Professor Atkins, over to you for your thoughts.
Thank you very much, and my thanks to Smart Semiotics and the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this session. And I would like to congratulate James on the upcoming publication of his book, Charles Peirce on Ethics, Aesthetics, and Normative Science. Personally, I've always enjoyed reading James's essays, and I've really learned a lot from them. And I'm sure that I will learn a lot from the book, as I did from the current presentation. So James has provided us with a very rich and detailed account of Peirce's normative sciences. And I agree with much of what he says, and I appreciate many of the points that he's made. I think especially the point that he's drawn our attention to about the pragmatic maxim and Peirce's refinements to it, ethical refinements to it in his later work are very important. So I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. I think my comments are questions. I don't think there are really any criticisms so much as questions to invite us for further reflection and discussion about what James has said. And they're going to fall into three categories broadly. First of all, the connection between reasonableness and truth, especially in relation to ethics. Secondly, the connection between theoretical and applied sciences. And just a couple comments on a third topic, Peirce's relation to Kant and to Aristotle. So let me start by asking a couple questions about the connection between reasonableness and truth. So I believe it's on slide 6 that James notes that the end of science is truth and the application of science is a secondary matter. And then on slide 38, he notes that logic is used to determine the most effective means to those ends, which ethics determines are the most admirable. And James remarks that for Peirce, the ultimate end is reasonableness, or at least that's the process to ascertain the end. So I want to ask about the connection between reasonableness and truth. One question I have is just which is the end, to be more reasonable or to pursue the truth, and are those connected? And then in ethical cases, I'm wondering if sometimes it might not be reasonable to hold false beliefs or to avoid ascertaining the truth. So perhaps having false beliefs about a person's motives will lead us to treat a person better. Or perhaps there are other cases where avoiding knowing some truth about a person is reasonable because it will lead us to treat the person better. So that's my, I guess, one question. And then another question I have is, might it not be appropriate to act unethically in the interest of truth? So obviously one case you can think of are grossly unethical scientific experiments, but what about other cases like a detective who engages in deception in order to catch a criminal? Or a lawyer who hides evidence because the lawyer knows that the defendant is guilty, but believes that the evidence might cause the jurors to have reasonable doubt. So there, one might say, well, it's unethical to hide the evidence, but by hiding it, you promote the truth because the jurors actually will come to the true belief. So those are just some questions about the connection between truth and reasonableness in relation to ethics. So that brings me to the second topic. I'm curious about the relationship between theoretical science and applied science. So I believe, James, that you described the application of science as a secondary matter and the pursuit of truth, the primary purpose of science. And I'm worried maybe we could overstate this. or at least it's not clear in what sense science's pursuit of truth is primary. So Peirce does recognize a distinction between theoretical science and applied scientists, and scientists, some of whom are theoreticians and some of whom are applied scientists. But as it seems to me, oftentimes the pursuit of practical aims in applied science leads to discoveries that are very helpful to theoretical scientific inquiries. And so one might say that while the primary aim of theoretical science and scientists is the truth, and the primary aim of applied science is the solution of practical problems, but then I wonder, why would you want to say that one is primary and the other is secondary? Peirce does say that his worry is that overemphasizing the applied side is going to lead to a contempt for theory, or to think that science is merely for making money. But I would think that both are very important pursuits in science, both application and truth. And that maybe neither is primary, but they are mutually informative. Okay, and that leads me just to my last couple comments about Kant and Aristotle. So James is very careful to separate Peirce's views from Kant's, but I wonder if the gulf is really quite as wide as James suggests. So certainly Kant is critical of the categorical imperative. You didn't quote this passage, but I'm sure you're familiar with it. Peirce says it's like a dog howling in the night. You know, why should I care about morality? I think that fits well with what you were saying, drawing on flip a foot. On the other hand, Kant also says, well, we need to know what the categorical imperative is. We need to bring it closer to intuition. And then when he starts to apply it, he's looking for varieties of contradiction. So there's different ways to understand how you're supposed to apply the first formulation, but some of those are teleological. And so in the promise case, he says that both the promise and the end one has is impossible. And so that's a sort of teleological contradiction. And I wonder how far, certainly there are differences between Kant and Peirce, but I wonder how far those differences really go. And then one just very quick comment about Aristotle. You mentioned that 3 criteria for the summum bonum, and one of them is that people find it admirable. And I wonder if that quite hits the nail on the head. Yes, I think people should find it admirable, but Peirce also says, well, maybe there's a whole perverse generation. And I wonder if the Aristotelian criterion of completeness isn't sort of what he really wants to aim at, that which is chosen for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. So in one passage from 1901, I think it is, Peirce says, subsequent life experience has taught me that the only thing that is really desirable without a reason for being so, to me that sort of rings of completeness, is to render ideas and things reasonable. Anyway, those are just some comments for further reflection. Again, James, I really appreciated your paper and appreciate the organizers for bringing me on board to participate. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I think we'll move straight on to our second discussant now. So we have Ron Beadle from Northumbria. Ron.
And to repeat Richard's thanks to the organizers and to James for his fascinating paper, and I too look forward to the book. Readers of Jean-Paul Sartre's La Nausée are perhaps particularly aware of the risk of writing biographies of historical figures, but one need not repeat Antoine Roquetin's, how should we describe it, nervous breakdown or moment of revelation to admire the tenacity of intellectual biographers who overcome the risks inherent to their projects. And unlike Sartre Roquetin, Dr. Liszka understands that he cannot do justice to his subject without providing a narrative account of the development of Peirce's thought, one in which compelling ideas are understood as goods to be strived for by both the biographer as they were by his subject. The challenge of writing a history of an intellectual's development are many and varied, and I shall highlight 6 of them, fully aware that my characterizations and omissions make this a far from exhaustive list. First, biographers need to work out, often in via, what genre of story is being told, a story of intellectual triumph or an account of decline, a story that requires the recreation of their subject's relationship to their particular tradition, to intellectual peers, and to the wider social context, or a story of radical, perhaps iconoclastic intellectual innovation, a story that in the retelling explains errors in previous accounts, or a story that resolves apparent inconsistencies in the original texts. There is likely to be more than one story in play, and both the relationships between these stories and the weight that is given to each comprise questions to which alternative answers are apparent in the work of different intellectual biographers. Second, biographers must navigate between narrative and analysis, between accounting for the development of their subject's original ideas as contributions to ongoing inquiries within their own tradition, and to its conflicts with other traditions, or to presenting and evaluating them.
Okay, so it looks like we've lost Ron there in the middle of a very interesting point. I think while we wait to see if Ron can join us, maybe the best thing to do is to skip straight over to Cornelius duvall from Indiana, who is our final discussant today. Cornelius, if you wouldn't mind sharing some thoughts, and then we'll see if Ron is able to join us again afterwards.
I can certainly do that. My internet connection also is a little bit unstable, so I might also at one point sort of suddenly freeze up. I would also like to begin by thanking Professor Liszka for his inspiring and insightful presentation, as well as the organizers of this conference for putting up the event and also inviting me to respond. I would like to begin with something that James says very early on, namely the claim that Peirce makes a somewhat exaggerated argument for the separation of theory and practice. This because I think that it holds the key to understanding Peirce's quote-unquote ethics. Indeed, Peirce draws a sharp distinction between a neatly organized set of theoretical sciences and what he calls a motley crowd of practical sciences, something he does in part to safeguard the disinterested search for truth from more worldly desires. Peirce then seeks to further safeguard these theoretical sciences, or sciences of discovery, by trying to ground them in phaneroscopy. This is crucial for Peirce because of his focus on truth as something that is to emerge at the end of inquiry, possibly in the indefinitely long run, and because in the short run, sciences may not do very well, and that is not something that should be held against them. Something similar is to be said about the pragmatic maxim indeed. Even though the maxim is successful, Peirce still insists that it be proven, and he does so again by seeking to ground it in phaneroscopy. And in both cases, ethics plays a key role. Pragmatism, of course, is for Peirce a principle of logic. It is part and parcel of the discipline that studies how one should reason if one wants to answer the questions one is asking, if one wants the answers to the questions one is asking to be true. So indeed, logic, as James rightly explains, is for Peirce a normative science. In fact, I think Peirce's realization that it is so goes way back. The main thrust of his famous illustrations of the logic of science papers is normative. They aim to explain how one should do science and why. About a decade later, Peirce develops this into his logic book, How to Reason, which essentially deals with the question how one should reason, and he repeatedly refers to logic as the art of reason as well. In How to Reason, for instance, Peirce writes, reasoning or inference is something which can be good or bad because it is within the domain of self-control. And then he continues that in order to understand right reasoning, it is important to trace its analogy to right conduct in general. And this is in 1894. However, simply acknowledging that logic is a normative affair does not by itself entail that it has to be grounded in ethics, or even that ethics has anything of value to say about it. Like the art of logic, the art of fencing too involves many prescriptions, and there are good and bad moves. Listening to ethicists, however, is unlikely to contribute much, if anything, to one's fencing ability. We see this disassociation of ethics from normativity play out in the Cambridge Conference lectures. Here Peirce writes that applying the prescriptions of ethics to the conduct of life is exceedingly dangerous, while at the same time happily prescribing that in the conduct of inquiry, we should never put up any roadblocks. So it seems that Peirce acknowledges that logic is normative, while at the same time maintaining that ethics, especially in its current state, is ill-equipped to deal with this, or is just the wrong place to go to. What then causes Peirce to change his mind? I think it is not so much qualms about how science and his pragmatic maxims are being pimped out, but rather his desire to provide some kind of grounding to the sciences of discovery. As is well known, Peirce does this by inserting what he calls the normative sciences between phaneroscopy and metaphysics. Now, what are these normative sciences and where do they come from? The Locutian normative sciences, or Normative Wissenschaften, originates with Friedrich Überweg. More specifically, his 1857 Système de Logique, a book that Peirce was particularly impressed with. In this book, Überweg distinguishes three normative sciences: logic, ethics, and aesthetics, which deal respectively with the laws that, if followed, lead to truth, goodness, and beauty. And although Überweg reverses the order, positions them differently within the classification of the sciences, and pays no attention to phenomenology, we find in the way he describes these three normative sciences the germ for how Peirce uses them. For Überweg, truth is that understanding which corresponds to reality. Goodness is the same understanding considered from the perspective of will and action, and beauty consists
This is what a real philosopher looks like.
And present Darstelling.
No.
So the approach to ethics we find in Überweg is quite different from the ethics Peirce is railing against in his first Cambridge lecture. I do look like a philosopher maybe, but could you please turn off your microphone? So the approach to ethics we find in Überweg is quite different from the ethics Peirce is railing against in the first Cambridge Conference lectures. At the same time, Überweg provides Peirce with the tools for unpacking the normativity of logic and connecting it with phaneroscopy, which Peirce did by repositioning the normative sciences and inverting their order. It also, however, leaves Peirce at a loss. If you were to ask whether prohibitions on human experimentations should be maintained, even when they block the road of inquiry, I'm not sure whether Peirce's discussion of the normative sciences will be of much help. It remains highly abstract and tightly focused on a specific question of grounding the theoretical sciences of discovery. Sciences that are kept exempt from dealing with any practical affairs to ensure that they really focus on truth without any extra grind or profits to reap. Returning then to Professor Liszka's observation that Peirce's separation between the theoretical and practical sciences is exaggerated, I should add that I agree with him. Inquiry is always a real-world activity with real consequences. So what happens when we relinquish this separation and treat them instead as extremes, which most of our scientific activity falling in the middle? As we saw, one way to look at Peirce's conception of logic is to see it as a set of norms that aim to inform us how we should reason when we do scientific inquiry, whether theoretical or practical. These norms are themselves products of inquiry. They are not external constraints, but they are constraints that emerged organically from the practice of science. Given how we acquired these norms, there is no reason to assume that they add up neatly. In fact, there are certainly situations where the imperative, never block the road of inquiry, conflicts with normative questions about the economy of research. Given scarcity of resources, we have no other option but to block some roads to open up others, even if all we are interested in is truth. So what gives? Fortunately for logic, the long run is quite forgiving. We can block certain avenues of research now and say that, assuming we are still interested, we can always open them up again later. In a similar vein, we could add more straightforwardly ethical prohibitions, such as a prohibition on human vivisection. We can say that, though it blocks certain inquiries now, we can always return to them in the future, preferably after we have devised alternative methods that enable us to answer those questions without human vivisection. Actually, there is no a priori prohibition that precludes us from asking whether there are any questions we should never inquire into, experiments we should never do, or technologies we should never develop, and add what we find to our toolbox of norms. That is the normative logic that Peirce developed, a toolbox that is always provisional, as like anything else we believe, such norms are always fallible. So despite Peirce's reluctance to ground logic, and with that scientific inquiry in ethics, that exceedingly dangerous discipline, and him largely restricting himself to a very bare abstract ethics, he may very well have opened up a Pandora's box. And I think that Professor Liszka, in trying to flesh this out, may have opened that box quite a bit further. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Duvall, for that. I think Ron is back with us. If you would like to kind of pick up, maybe from the beginning again, we lost you fairly early, and share your thoughts with us now.
Thanks. And thanks again to Dr. Liszka and to the organizers of the seminar. Readers of Jean-Paul Sartre's La Nausée are perhaps particularly aware of the risk of writing biographies of historical figures, but one need not repeat Antoine Roquetin's "How should we describe it?" nervous breakdown or moment of revelation to admire the tenacity of intellectual biographers who overcome the risks inherent to their projects. And unlike Sartre or Roquetin, Dr. Liszka understands that he cannot do justice to his subject without providing a narrative account of the development of Peirce's thought, one in which compelling ideas are understood as goods to be strived for by both the biographer and his subject. The challenge of writing a history of an intellectual's development are many and varied. I shall highlight 6 of them, fully aware that my characterizations and omissions make this far from an exhaustive list. First, biographers need to work out, often in via, what genre of story is being told: a story of intellectual triumph or an account of decline, a story that requires the recreation of their subject's relationship to their particular tradition, to intellectual peers, and to the wider social context, or a story of radical, perhaps iconoclastic intellectual innovation, a story that in the retelling explains errors in previous accounts, or a story that resolves apparent inconsistencies in the original texts. There is likely to be more than one story in play, and both the relationships between these stories and the weight that is given to each comprise questions to which alternative answers are apparent in the work of different intellectual biographers. Second, biographers must navigate between narrative and analysis, between accounting for the development of their subject's original ideas as contributions to ongoing inquiries within their own tradition and to its conflicts with other traditions, or to presenting and evaluating them against contemporary standards rather than by their contribution to the debates of their own time. Third, biographers must manage the complexity inherent to their material. The fusion of horizons that this involves tests the biographer as much as their subject. The unfortunate consumers of poor intellectual biographies, poor because of biographers' lack of facility, poor because written to please, poor because written to wound, are the victims of their biographers' intellectual vices. Fourth, biographers face the challenge to any historian of collecting and judiciously weighing evidence, of revising their anticipated account in light of new material, alongside the particular risk in intellectual biographies that their subject's work or the new material that they have brought to bear upon it reveals vices that they had not anticipated, incoherence that they had not expected. Fifth is the challenge of maintaining focus in the face of fatigue, of neither being tempted to pursue novel lines of inquiry for their own sake, nor of rejecting them in the face of deadlines or fear of the additional work required to resolve them. And finally, for biographers well versed in the tradition they share with their subjects, as is the case here, are the personal challenges that may require them to revise or repudiate their own previous theses and arguments, or to take issue with the work of friends or colleagues. In the literature with which I am most familiar, there are examples of biographers whose horizons are so much more limited than their subjects that they have done little more than provide a chronology of outputs, of those who intended to attack and critique their subject before being converted by their theses and arguments, of those who were insufficiently thorough, missing or mistaking facts, sources, and important contextual features, and of those who present one aspect of their subject's work with insufficient attention to others. Finally, there are biographers whose subject has praised them for the contribution that their work has made to their own understanding of it, although sadly, Dr. Liszka cannot be so praised by Peirce, but one suspects that he might have been. Seems to me that Dr. Liszka has met all of these challenges admirably. This story is told and is best told in relation to both the intellectual tradition that Peirce helped to create and also to the most relevant features of the material and ideational history of his time. As for genre, this appears to me to be a conversion story in which his subject became a surprised and perhaps reluctant Aristotelian, but this was an Aristotelianism in form rather than content. First, his relegation of the virtues to the role of means negates the internal relationship between eudaimonia and the virtues required by any authentically Aristotelian account. Second, his distinction between ethics and aesthetics, the former providing practical rationality, the latter the goods towards which we should be directed, invites the characteristic weakness of the Enlightenment project in providing elegant accounts of what morality requires of us, but no reason why we should behave morally. Peirce's process fares no better than Kant's imperative. In 1893, Peirce predicted that, and I quote, "The 20th century in its latter half shall surely see the deluge tempest burst upon the social order, to clear upon a world as deep in ruin as that greed philosophy has long plunged it into guilt." Close quote. After a century of disastrous experiments of living, Peirce's version of an evolutionary development towards the good appears naive. His optimism about the growth of reasonableness starkly contrasts with the record. The sharpness of Peirce's distinction between practical rationality and a science of ends is mirrored by Dr. Liszka's presentation of Peirce's normative science in isolation from Peirce's own practical rationality. By contrast, the Thomistic Aristotelian Alasdair MacIntyre has argued, most recently in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, that we need narratives of biographical subject practical rationality. His recent biographical sketches of Father Dennis Fall, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, Vasily Grossman, and C.L.R. James introduced their thinking, but also the decisions that directed the course of their lives. These types of biographical accounts reveal coherence or otherwise with their subjects' purposes, the quality of friendships that informed them, a critical feature for any Aristotelian, by the way, and those virtues and vices that enabled or undermined their movement towards the goods they pursued and the defeat of the evils they fought. MacIntyre writes, open quote, "If it is true, as I have claimed, that we understand the vicissitudes of our desires and the course and outcomes of our practical reasoning in narrative terms, then this is best demonstrated not by philosophical arguments, necessary as those are, but by illuminating examples of narratives of the relevant kind, narratives that make the actions of particular agents intelligible and show them to be justified or unjustified." Close quote. If I have a criticism of Dr. Liszka's account, it is that his intellectual biography would have benefited from an examination of the relationship between Peirce's normative science of ethics and the practical rationality of a life which, in many ways, seems to have gone badly wrong. This is not to question Dr. Liszka's achievement. He has had to piece together his story from a wide variety of sources to create a narrative from fragments and to present a coherent account of a highly particular ethical journey of a thinker determined to resolve what he understood as the central incoherence of his own tradition, and found that only radical theoretical innovation could overcome this. Dr. Liszka has done his tradition an enormous service by constructing a comprehensive explication from the fragments that Peirce left behind. It is a considerable achievement of intellectual detection. The Enlightenment project's failed attempts to find a rational basis for an ethics that abjured both desire and teleology provoked the dominance of emotivism from the early to mid-20th century. Pragmatism has provided a powerful and certainly more optimistic alternative, despite Peirce's critique of its instrumentalism. Alongside emotivism, it offered sophistication for those of a theoretical disposition, but sadly easy excuses to the wider culture. Dr. Liszka has shown how Peirce anticipated, but ultimately could do nothing to avoid this.
Thank you, Ron, for your thoughts. So we have a few minutes left. There are a few questions in the Q&A, but first, James, I wondered if you would like to kind of very briefly respond to any of the points raised by the discussants.
So many points, it'd be hard to do that quickly in the minutes remaining. Just let me say that I've taken notes about each of the criticisms and concerns, and hope to respond to each of the respondents in turn, if I can, privately or otherwise. But just to say that I thought these were really good thoughts and issues that were raised by each of the respondents about Peirce. The issue between reasonableness and truth from Professor Atkins, the general issue of narrative and trying to discern the motivation and analysis of any thinker that you're trying to evaluate or talk about from Professor Beadle. And certainly Professor Duvall's comments as one of the best known Peirce scholars were very helpful and very enlightening on that. I think the issue that he especially raised about the dangerousness of ethics as Peirce saw it is an interesting thought. I tried to address that in the book, but it would be too long and difficult to explain that now. But I'm especially concerned with that comment. Yeah. And I believe there is an explanation for that.
Great, thank you. As I said, we do have probably about 5 minutes left. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, if you feel like tackling one of those. Terry Moore says that you make no mention of the relation of ethics to metaphysics. Peirce's view that whatever is beyond control is beyond criticism is the obvious bridge between the two. For Peirce, ethics and aesthetics and logic don't depend on metaphysics or principles. But if certain metaphysical propositions are true, certain forms of determinism, the normative sciences would be senseless. How does Peirce secure the metaphysical presuppositions normative science requires?
Yeah, I'm afraid I didn't. It was a little muffled, so I couldn't quite understand the question. Is it written in the chat room, or?
It is, yeah. So in the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll be able to see it there.
I don't see it here.
Okay.
Could you just repeat it again?
Sure, I'll go more slowly. So you make no mention of the relation of ethics to metaphysics. Peirce's view that whatever is beyond control is beyond criticism is the obvious bridge between the two. For Peirce, ethics and aesthetics and logic don't depend on metaphysics for principles, but if certain metaphysical propositions are true, certain forms of determinism, the normative sciences would be senseless. How does Peirce secure the metaphysical presuppositions normative science requires?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I mean, it's certainly right that in terms of the order of the sciences, the hierarchy of the sciences, metaphysics comes after phenomenology and the normative sciences. Mathematics is the prime science. It's the science of all sciences. So one should be able to see mathematical principles at the basis of phenomenology, at the basis of the normative sciences, and at the basis of metaphysics. So metaphysical concepts like continuity, the principle of synecism, are based on real mathematical theories. The convergence theory of truth is based on the law of large numbers. So there's this mathematical grounding to almost everything that Peirce does. That's why mathematics is the first of the sciences of discovery. So the grounding of metaphysics really rests on mathematics. So that's where one would find, let's say, the grounding of any kind of metaphysical principle that's being used in the normative sciences, I would say. I don't know if the other Peirce scholars here agree with that or not. Thank you very much for that.
So it's approaching 1:30 now, so I think we should leave things there. This session has been recorded, so if anyone does want to go back and refresh themselves on all of these points that have been made, you can find the recording on the Smart Semiotics website. I'd like to thank Professor Liszka for his fascinating presentation, and all three of our discussants for joining us today. And I think the only thing left for me to say is we hope to see you for the next seminar. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
And my thanks to everybody for participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.